point was, the hell with him. If he's not going to listen to us, let's go in there and support the coup and get it over with. Well, after studying his options and listening to the people before, did President Kennedy give his approval to support the coup, or did he give his disapproval? Approval. Approved it. Even though his brother, the Secretary of Defense, and his main general spoke against it, Kennedy gave his support to support the coup against Diem. Now, the president had one, you always got to have something out. We're going to do this, but this is what's got to happen. Once the country was overthrown, what did Kennedy want done with Diem? What do you think he wanted? When they captured Diem and overthrew, what were they going to do with him? What did Kennedy want to do with him? What's that? What kind of? Exile him. Send him out of the country. What didn't he want done to him? Kill, obviously, because he didn't want to be involved in backing a coup in which they assassinate their leader, right? So, the president made it very clear that if Diem was overthrown, he was to be exiled out of the country of Vietnam. Well, on November 1st of 1963, 21 days before the president was assassinated, the South Vietnamese military acted and overthrew the sitting leaders of the South Vietnamese government with American support. Now, do we have troops that supported them? No, moral support. We're behind them. Okay? And that happened on November 1st of 1963, just 21 days before the president was assassinated. So, did the South Vietnamese military live up to Kennedy's expectations of exiling Diem out of the country after they overtook him? No, they executed him and his brother. They executed him and his brother. President Kennedy was not thrilled. They executed both Diem and Diem's brother. He was very shocked at that assassination of Diem. It was something he obviously did not support. And after the assassination of Prime Minister Diem, Kennedy was pressed hard to do what? Huh? Opposite. Send troops. Send troops. So after Diem was assassinated, President Kennedy was pressed and pressured to send military troops to Vietnam. Who was in support of that? Who thought he should? Give me a guess of people we've talked about. Who thought he should send troops in? I will just say that the military Joint Chiefs of Staff, which included Maxwell Taylor, said, let's send troops in. Who else? Who wanted to support the coup in the cabinet? The only one. Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of State Dean Rusk also said, hey, let's send troops in. And do you remember Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy from the Cuban Missile Crisis? He also pressed the president to send troops. So those three people said, we can't let South Vietnam fall. It will endanger all of Southeast Asia. We must send troops. And that again would be the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including General Maxwell Taylor, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy told the president, quote, we can't let South Vietnam fall. It will endanger all of Southeast Asia. Got to be somebody on the other side, right? To talk to Kennedy the other way. And you had a chance to visit this fellow's gravestone in D.C. Who was the man that spoke on the other side of sending troops? No?
No, Senator
Mike Mansfield of Montana. Sat down with President Kennedy and he gave him this quote. He said, quote, it's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you'll never get out. How astute was Senator Mike Mansfield? Was he absolutely correct? It turned out to be nothing but a quagmire. And when we got in with an army, we had a hell of a time getting out. So Senator Mansfield knew the region of Vietnam, and he told President Kennedy, quote, "It's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you'll never get out." Well, although historians say he was leaning towards non-involvement, his final decision would never be known, because what happened 3 weeks later? He was assassinated. So before he could decide on whether he was going to send American troops into Vietnam, he was assassinated. So President Kennedy would lean towards non-involvement, according to history, but his final decision would never be known, as 3 weeks later he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So who gets to make the call? Lyndon Johnson. And this is where the Vietnam War, in my mind, goes completely sideways. Okay? Now, after the assassination of Kennedy, President Johnson stated publicly his intentions on the issue of Vietnam. And I'm going to give you a direct quote. And you tell me what you think it means. Okay? After the assassination of Kennedy, President Johnson stated publicly his intentions on the issue of Vietnam with one sentence quote. And then you tell me what you think he meant by it. Quote, "I am not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went." That was his intentions on Vietnam when he took office. "I am not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went." What's his intentions, Pete? He's going to send through them. But he's got to get an excuse to do it. We'll talk about that. Now, I have said this before, and I'll say it again. Historians have stated on many occasions that President Kennedy could have never imagined what the United States would be embroiled in concerning Vietnam by 1973. 10 years later, if he would have come off the dead and saw what happened in Vietnam between 1963 and 1973, he would have never imagined such a mess that we got ourselves in. Okay? Now, I'm going to read from a book here. I just want you to listen, put your pencils down. This is from a book called If Kennedy Lived. This is a book that was written by Jeff Greenfield on if Kennedy would have lived instead of been assassinated. It goes through lots of different scenarios. But I'm going to read the Vietnam scenario to you. Okay? "And in South Vietnam, question mark, for almost 3 years his advisors had been giving him such conflicting advice that he had once asked 2 of them, 'Are you sure you two went to the same country?' The South Vietnamese Army, with the help of 15,000 American advisors, making any headway against the Viet Cong guerrillas? Is the government of Diem winning the hearts and minds of the people? Diem and his brother had seemed more interested in suppressing the majority than dealing with the corruption and incompetence in their government. And while his joint chiefs in Rusket State and Bundry in the White House were telling him, 'We can't let South Vietnam fall, it will endanger all of Southeast Asia,' others, Ken Galbraith, his Indian ambassador, Senator Mike Mansfield, who knew the region, and General Charles de Gaulle of France, were telling him, 'It's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you will never get out.' His own George Ball had said flatly that if the United States went in with ground troops, it would have 300,000 or more casualties in a year or 2. That idea was nuts, of course, he had told George, but still, wait till you get the numbers later. Okay? As for his own instincts, well, just yesterday in Washington, at the beginning of a meeting with a young State Department aide, Mike Forrestal, JFK beckoned him back in the Oval Office. 'Wait a minute,' he said. 'After the first of the year, I want you to organize an in-depth study of every possible options we've got in Vietnam, including how to get out. We have to review this whole thing from the bottom to the top.'" He was thinking about pulling advisors out at that point. But he was also a man of finely honed political instincts, and they told him he couldn't cut his losses now, even if he wanted to. Not with an election coming up, not with the prospect that the Republicans would yell, "Who lost Vietnam?" just the way they and a lot of Democrats had yelled, "Who lost China?" at Truman back in 1949. Hell, as a young congressman, he had been one of them who yelled at Truman, "Who lost China?" That's why he told O'Donnell Mansfield, and everyone else that nothing was going to happen until after he was re-elected. For God's sake, all anyone had to do was look at the full-page ad in the Dallas Morning News, boarded in black, paid for by H.L. Hunt and a group of Dallas businessmen on the far right, or more or less accusing of him of treason. Remember the placards that came out that said wanted for treason? Okay? He wasn't going to make a decision on Vietnam until after the election of 1964. You think about that when we talk about how this thing went. Okay, that'll take us to our next and last subtopic of the day. I think one of the most criminal laws ever passed in American history, President Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. President Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This is quite a story. In the summer of 1964, there was a naval skirmish off the coast of Vietnam that led to a very rapid expansion of American involvement in Vietnam. A naval skirmish. What's the difference between a skirmish and a fist fight?
Small.
Yeah, a skirmish is smaller. You know, so two kids are fighting in the hall. As a principal, I had to decide whether it was a skirmish or a fight. I mean, if fists were hitting faces and bloody noses were coming about, it was one thing. If somebody pushed each other and it was a little bit of a skirmish, it was a different thing. So a skirmish is always less. So in the summer of 1964, a single naval skirmish led to rapid expansion of American involvement in Vietnam. On August 2nd of 1964, a ship called the USS Maddox, which I think is on the orange sheet but not on the yellow sheet. On August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox reportedly exchanged gunfire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Listen to that statement. On August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox reportedly exchanged gunfire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. And this exchange between North Vietnamese torpedo boats and the USS Maddox occurred off the North Vietnamese coast in an area known as the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay? So this exchange, or this skirmish between the USS Maddox and North Vietnamese torpedo boats reportedly happened off the North Vietnamese coast in an area known as the Gulf of Tonkin. Well, when that news got back to President Johnson that the North Vietnamese had been on the aggressive, he made arrangements to appear on national television and speak to the American people about the issue of Vietnam. Okay? So after that exchange, President Johnson made arrangements to appear on national television to speak to the American people. And he spoke to the American people on national television on August 4th. And he appeared on national television and he told the people about the reported attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, and he insisted that the actions of the North Vietnamese, in his mind, were an act of war. So he gets on national television on August 4th, 1964, and he tells the American people about this reported exchange between the USS Maddox and North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and he insists that the actions of those torpedo boats were an act of war. And he tells the American people that he's going to go to Congress and he's going to ask them to grant him full authority to take whatever action necessary against North Vietnam for their actions against the USS Maddox. So he's going to go to Congress and he's going to ask them to give him full authority to do basically whatever he wants to do concerning North Vietnam. Does that make sense? And it might seem a little odd to you. Well, he did. He went to Congress and he said, you know what? These damn North Vietnamese are acting out in warlike fashion, and I want to have full authority to do whatever I want to do. And 3 days later, on August 7th, 1964, Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. On August 7th, Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And I want you to write down exactly what this resolution did so you get a full idea of the authority this guy has. Okay? So, here's what the Gulf of Tonkin resolution does. Please write this down. It granted President Johnson the full power. It granted President Johnson the full power to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution officially granted President Johnson the full power to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution officially granted President Johnson the full power to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. JC, what's that giving him the power to do?
Pretty much anything.
Anything he wants without what?
Without permission.
Kind of. So this has to go through the House and it has to go through the Senate, right? There are 414 members of the House of Representatives. When they voted on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, it passed 414 to 0. Not one member of the House questioned the authority they were giving the President. Not one. 414 to 0. There were 90 members of the Senate. It passed the Senate 88 to 2. The two members that voted against it were Senator Ernest Gruing of Alaska and this guy right here, Senator Wayne Morris of Oregon. It passed 88 to 2 in the Senate. The only two that voted against it were Ernest Gruing of Alaska and Wayne Morris of Oregon. Guess who later told me in person it was one of the biggest mistakes of his life to support that resolution? Mike Mansfield. Now, to let you know what Morris thought about this, and this is kind of sums it up, this is how Senator Morris defended his vote. You can write this down or not, it's up to you. This is what he said. People said, why would you not support this? And he said, quote, we are in effect giving the President war-making powers in the absence of a declaration of war. I believe this to be a historical mistake. And boy, was he ever right. Was he ever right. He said again, we are in effect giving the President war-making powers in the absence of a declaration of war. I believe this to be a historical mistake. And that's what happens. What's farther we get into this, and President Johnson's going to be able to make all these decisions he wants as far as sending troops and doing all these things in Vietnam without ever having a formal declaration of war. Do you guys realize that? The Vietnam War cost 58,000 American lives, and there was never a formal declaration of war. It was all President Johnson. Okay, tomorrow, if you want to get a jump start, we're going to talk about the American and South Vietnamese strategy in the war. Actually, we're not going to do that tomorrow, because tomorrow the newspaper's coming in to talk about the trip, and David Tomrup is going to come in on behalf of the board. So you don't have to bring your binders tomorrow, just bring yourself and listen to questions and answer them, and we'll kind of go from there and we'll get through that part, okay? And be candid with David Tomrup. He's very nice to come in as a board member and spend his time in this class. He does it quite often. Has he been in here before this year? He really is very, very interested. He's excited about coming in and hearing about the trip. And so the newspaper will get your feelings on that, and we'll go from there. Okay? Awesome. Remember, the AP scholarship will be due at 4 o'clock today. Again, I'm going to send that to Lieutenant Colonel Kristen Wood and her staff, and they are going to rank those. We will pick two $250 scholarship winners based on their ranking. Okay? I could never pick who to give it to, so I'll let them do that. Okay? Yes?
What is that one?